Welcome to the Exotic Pet Collective podcast. My name is Richard. You may know me from my YouTube channel, The Tarantula Collective. And today we have a special guest. A fellow podcaster is coming on this show. But first, I would like to thank the sponsor of today's podcast. Those are my friends over at Tarantula Cribs. They're huge supporters of the Tarantula Collective YouTube channel and of this podcast and pretty much anything that I do. So a huge shout out to them. If you're looking for high-end acrylic enclosures for your tarantulas, scorpions, or pretty much any other invert, you need to check out Tarantula Cribs. I use them myself. I am a huge fan of them. The acrylic is much thicker than most of the other acrylic enclosures out there. It's extremely clear, but the best part is it has these sliding locking lids. They use very powerful magnets to keep those lids locked into place, and they go in on tracks, so there's no way for the tarantula or scorpion or whatever inverts you have to really pry those open. I've been using them for months now. I really enjoy them. They look amazing. They work really well. I've had no issues with them, so you should definitely check those out. And right now, if you go to tarantulacribs.com and use the code TCollective10 at checkout, you will get 10% off your entire order. Whether you're looking for some awesome display enclosures for your spiderlings or you're looking for a large enclosure for your adult tarantulas, they've got that and everything in between. So definitely check them out. They even have stuff for the enclosures like hides, water dishes, plants, just all kinds of decorations. They even have some skulls. So go to tarantulacribs.com, use that code TCollective10, save yourself 10%, and help support the community. So huge thanks to Tarantula Cribs for believing in this podcast and believing in the YouTube channel and doing so much to support this. It really means a lot to me. You guys are awesome. This is Animals at Home. If you're not familiar, you should definitely check him out. I have his website scrolling on the bottom of the screen. He also has a YouTube channel. You can find him on Instagram. He's all over the place, mainly focusing on reptiles and conservation. So welcome to the show, Animals at Home.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to having this chat with you.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. So we talked just a few moments ago before we started recording, but you're actually up in Canada, correct?
Yep, I'm in Manitoba, which is a province sort of a little bit just north of sort of North Dakota, Minnesota area. So it gets real cold here in the winter. I just went out for a run this morning. It was minus 38 degrees Celsius. So yeah. So that's kind of where I come from. So there's not a ton of reptile life around where I am, but that's where I grew up. And I find there's it's a pretty small reptile community out here. So most of my listeners and subscribers are definitely American.
That's what was going to be my next question. What is the exotic pet hobby like in Canada? Do you have a lot of like expos and stuff like that, or is it pretty small?
Well, I'm in a fairly remote area. I would say it's not super remote, but I live in a decently large city. But to get to another large city is going to be like a 7 or 8 hour drive. So we would before COVID, we'd have like our one expo a year, which is pretty small. Like it's just a sort of a gymnasium type setup. And in Canada, there are a few larger expos, like in sort of the Alberta area as well as Toronto. Normally has a huge Canadian sort of breeder expo. Again, before COVID, but those are all, that one is fairly substantial. I've never been to it. It's, about 24-hour drive from where I live, but it's nothing compared to what the Americans have, those huge, massive expos. It's nothing like that. So I would say things are just more spread apart here. There is a decent community. We're just kind of fewer and far between. I mean, the population is so much smaller and the country is so much more sparse that it's not like your next door neighbor probably isn't going to care about reptiles type thing.
Yeah. So how long have you been in the reptile hobby?
I got my first crested gecko, I still have today, in 2007. So I've been keeping reptiles for, I guess, about 13 years or so. But I didn't really engage with the hobby very much during those first few years. I think it took me, I'm going to say, I think it wasn't even until in 2015 where I added my second reptile. So I had a long stretch of just a single reptile, and then in 2015 I got another gecko, and then that sort of snowballed a little bit. And now I only have 6 animals. It's not like my collection's huge. So I would say I've been like engaged with the hobby since 2015, but I've been keeping reptiles for since 2007.
I gotcha. What mainly is in your collection right now?
I have
mainly geckos, or
I have 2 geckos. I have a crested gecko and a day gecko, and then I have 4 snakes. So I have 2 boa imperators, a Brazilian rainbow boa, and a jungle carpet python. And that's where I want my collection to stay for now. My focus is much more shifted towards sort of improving the care of the animals that I have. And as much as I want more animals, it's sometimes nice to kind of pump the brakes a little bit and focus on the collection that I have.
That's a very reasonable kind of mindset you have there, because I don't know. Have you ever kept tarantulas or scorpions or any inverts before?
I have not, but I had
No.
Tom Moran on my podcast a few years ago now. I think it was like 2019 or something, and we kind of talked about the sort of the same snowball effect in the tarantula world, but it's probably even worse because it's easier and smaller enclosures and whatnot in keeping tarantulas, right?
Yeah, we've talked about that a few times on this podcast, just how addictive it can get, and because they're so easy to take care of, and they can also be very reclusive. So you may get 5 tarantulas and not see them for weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So then you're like, well, they're not. I don't really need to feed them or anything. More than once or twice a month in some cases. So you end up getting more and get more, and before you know it, your basement looks like mine.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I just recently did a video on that concept of and it would work in the invert hobby as well, where there's a fine line between engaging in the hobby, but also kind of slipping into a little bit of an addiction style of keeping, where you end up. I talked about this effect that happens. It's sort of this tendency in humans. It's called the hedonic treadmill, and this is where we sort of return to a baseline happiness, external or regardless of your external stimulus. So maybe you're at a 7 out of 10 as far as your happiness goes, and then you want to buy a new animal, so you start to get that dopamine spike. You start to feel some pleasure and excitement, and the dopamine spike actually hits its peak before you purchase an animal. Then you purchase it, you bring an animal home, and you're kind of still excited, but then it starts to wane, and you return back to that sort of 7 out of 10. And now you've adjusted and you've completely adapted to this new scenario of having an additional animal, and the only cure to that is going out and getting another animal. And it's actually a vicious cycle, and there are ways around it, but if you're not paying attention to what you're doing, you may end up just continuously running on the treadmill, thinking that you're enjoying the hobby, but really you're just fulfilling that treadmill, and you're going to run into a scenario where you've run out of time and money because you have a basement full of animals.
It's very true. I've fallen into that trap, not just with like animals, like tarantulas and stuff, but it's just in many aspects of my life. Don't have so much of a scientific kind of view at it. My mind, I guess, is a little more metaphorical. I always looked at it as if you're painting and you're mixing colors on your palette, trying to come up with this amazing color, and you do, it's very exciting. You're like, oh, this is awesome. Kind of like, when I'm searching online, buying a new tarantula or scorpion or something. But as soon as you take that paint and you put it on the canvas, now it's just part of the background. Like, it's no longer this amazing color on your palette. It's just one color in a whole, painting full of different shades and colors. It just loses that kind of excitement right away.
Yeah, it's weird. There's this excitement in the fantasy more than the actual reality, and I think that's just part of our human programming. And like you said, it's not just in reptiles. We're going to have that experience across the board, but it is something that can be dangerous if we're caring for animals.
Yeah, I mean, I see that a lot. I have people reach out to me that are just overwhelmed because they got too many tarantulas too quickly, and it's not so much. It's not really expensive keeping tarantulas. I mean, you just got to buy crickets every now and then to feed them. Other than that, they're pretty simple to take care of. But it's just the time, and I think sometimes it's just that feeling of responsibility is overwhelming to some people. So you see a lot of people that they come in hard and burn out fast. So they go from like no tarantulas, and then a year later they have 100 tarantulas, and then 6 months or a year later they're selling all their tarantulas. Like, I'm out of the hobby. I'm tired. But I couldn't imagine doing that with reptiles. I mean, I have 4 snakes, a day gecko, and a couple of leopard geckos. And that's like, I'm at my, like, people are like, hey, I'll send you a snake. And I'm like, I don't want any more reptiles. Like, this is a handful as it is. I spend like 80% of my time that I'm doing care and husbandry on my reptiles compared to, 100 tarantulas.
It's funny because people in the fish hobby, like people in the reptile hobby, see the fish hobby as like the next level of busyness, because you're perpetually having to do stuff like water changes and feeding like every single day, where with snakes you're not feeding, maybe once every couple of weeks type thing. So it is interesting, and like you said, you can't imagine having that many animals or that many reptiles, but many people do, right? They have these just ridiculously large collections, and it's the same thing. They get overwhelmed and inevitably see that post on Craigslist or Facebook or whatever. I'm ditching everything. Someone come, take my collection away from me because I can't handle this anymore.
Yeah, it's always sad to see that, but it's kind of inevitable, I think. Do you have what's the most difficult reptile you say that in your collection, as far as like time and commitment?
Honestly, not too bad. I would say the snakes are really easy for the most part. Especially right now, I kind of usually fast my snakes through the winter, so there's really nothing to do there besides change water. So I would say the geckos maybe, but I'm making food like every couple of days or feeding them insects. That's probably the most amount of work, but I have really tried my best to change my focus from to direct it towards more of improving the care. So putting my money and my time into, improving enclosures and changing equipment and getting larger enclosures and more enrichment and whatnot. So I would say that's what takes up most of my time is, I'll sit down and say, okay, I need to redo my entire day gecko enclosure, and I'll spend 6 weeks redoing it and spending a bunch of money and doing all that. So that's where probably most of my time and effort kind of goes into, I'd say.
I'd like to talk about your day gecko for a little bit, if that's
Sure.
all right. I also have a day gecko, and pretty much as far as anything that I have in my collection, that's probably the one species I'm the least confident in my husbandry, I guess. I mean, I've had it now for, probably almost 2 years, but I've changed its enclosure probably 4 times. It seems every time I'll make an enclosure and post some pictures online or show it in a video and just get this flood of comments like, oh no, that's not the right way to keep it. And so then I do some more research and I'll change its setup. And then it just seems like there's a lot of division, or I don't know exactly how to, how can I ask this? How do you keep yours? And what do you think is the best method and type of enclosure for day geckos?
Well, it's a good question. Are you keeping a giant day gecko? Or what species?
Yes.
A giant day gecko? Yeah.
That's the issue. I went to a pet shop, and it was they had it on sale for like $19.99 or something. My kid was like, "Oh, I really want that," and I knew a little bit because I've been keeping geckos for a minute, like leopard geckos. Did a little bit of research online, like pretty much literally in the pet store, and I was like, "Well, I've got because I'm gonna have a garage full of all different shapes and sizes of enclosures," and I was like, "Well, I think I got everything we need," and it was something. It was like 90% off or 80% off or something like that at the pet store. So I let him get that and got everything set up. But yeah, it just said Madagascar day gecko.
Mm-hmm.
Madagascar giant day gecko, something like that.
Yeah. So it's a giant day gecko. Yeah. So, they're fairly straightforward. They're an arboreal species. So typically people like to provide them with more height, which is, I agree with, but at the same time, arboreal means that the gecko spends time in the trees. It doesn't really necessarily mean it spends time moving up and down trees. And I think that's one of the areas in the reptile hobby we sometimes get confused. We think like, oh, because it lives in the trees, it wants to have a really tall enclosure that it can move up and down. But really, it likes to spend time in the canopy. So my enclosure is, I think, about 3 feet wide and about 3 feet tall, I think. So it's fairly tall. I think it's 30 inches tall, so just under 3 feet tall. But it gives her a lot of lateral space in that sort of canopy. So yes, I've never seen her on the ground. She never spends any time there, but she also wants to move back and forth and have space. So that's one thing I always say, like if you're going to get an arboreal species, it's important to think about that as well. Give them space off the ground, but not just vertical space. Still, you want that horizontal lateral space. And then as far as care, just in general, you need a UV index of usually between 3 and 4, so usually a 6% UVB bulb is pretty good depending on the height of the basking zone. And then I use halogen heating for mine just on a dimmer. Usually the hot spot sits around like 88 to 90 degrees. And I have an LED jungle dawn in there as well to provide lots of intense visible light, which is great for the plants. She's in a bioactive enclosure, so she's got tons of plants. The plants absolutely love that light. And then as far as that, the temperatures, like in Madagascar, it gets pretty cold as well. Like you can get down into the 60s and the 50s at night during the winter. So I don't have any heat on at night. I kill the heat at night. I let my room usually drops to around 72 degrees when I don't worry about that at all. And then humidity kind of ranges between the 50 to 80%. I have a misting system, so I mist her a couple of times a day. And then I have a fogger that comes on at the night just to sort of simulate some of that, fog that might roll in the mountains. In Madagascar, typically you're only going to get fog once the sun sets. So I do simulate that as well, just to give the humidity a spike during the evening, which is where the humidity always spikes. And that's pretty much it. I could definitely answer any questions that you might have about her though, or it.
Yeah, I was feeling really good right up until you started talking about the fogging, because I originally had kept mine in an Exoterra. What is that, like the small tall or whatever? It was like 18, 24 inches tall.
Yeah.
And that was initially what I put it in. It seemed to have plenty of room, really. And then it started growing. And I was like, okay, you're looking a little cramped in there. Moved it into a larger arboreal enclosure. And that's when people started saying what you were just saying. Like they need more vertical or more horizontal movement as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I changed it up. It's behind me, but you can't see me because I'm in the way. But so I put it in a longer enclosure that is tall with plenty of climbing, and she seems to be doing really well.
Mm-hmm.
My issue, I guess, I don't have a mister, like a misting system. I've considered getting one a few times, but I've never pulled the trigger. I just mist her every night, like when I'm going around. Kind of, I feel sometimes that like a jailer. Like I come down before I like settle in for the night and make sure everybody's doing okay. All the enclosures are shut down tight and everything. And that's when I'll mist her, feed the betta fish, stuff like that. And I bought a fogger, and I was essentially for her enclosure. And I had so many issues with it leaking. I was using a Zoomed fogger, and it would work well for like 2 days. And then all of a sudden, I'd come downstairs and there was just water all over the place. And
Oh, weird.
I started getting very frustrated, and it was like, all right, I'm not using this anymore. What kind of fogger do you use for yours?
So I just went to Walmart and bought just an ultrasonic humidifier. So I think it's just like a Honeywell, just classic brand. And there's a video on my channel of how I converted it into a fogger. So foggers are great. They work well for maintaining humidity, but they are often used, I think, poorly in the hobby, because the one thing about fog that's kind of the downside of it is it looks so cool. So people often will pump their enclosures full of the fog, so you have this like really heavy mist, and it looks very cool. But we have to remember that in nature, in the wild, there is no fog in the middle of the day. The sun evaporates that moisture as soon as it hits a certain temperatures. Like you'll have fog maybe until 9 or 10 in the morning if it happens to be a very foggy day, but you're not going to have it at like the blazing middle of the day. You're not going to have fog. So it actually creates a lot of heat because the moisture holds heat, and it can be difficult for the animal to even breathe that fog in. So fogging is awesome to use, but it should really be used in the evenings. And you also want to use it in an enclosure that has decent ventilation. So I do fog my crested gecko. It's something I've just started doing recently. And like I said, he's 15 years old. I'm just still trying new things with him. And I find the exoterras are decent at ventilation, but it still does build up some of that mist in there. It starts to collect into the enclosure, which is probably not the best. So I still have to tinker with that a little bit. My day gecko is in a Zilla enclosure that's screen. So I can fog it like crazy, and the fog will just billow out the bottom. So it's keeping the humidity high, but it's constantly, moving through the enclosure, and it's not building up and creating this like steam room effect, which is kind of what you want to avoid. So that's what I recommend for anyone that wants to use a fogger. Use them at night for a few hours, however you want, and turn it on during the day so you can see how the fog moves through the enclosure, and make sure that it's leaving the enclosure at the bottom vent of some sort.
So can you clarify what type of enclosure you're referring to when you say the screen enclosure? Are you talking like I can't remember the name of I don't know if it's Exoterra, what brand it is, but they use it a lot for chameleons. Is it that type of screen enclosure?
It's similar. I think the one you're probably thinking of is the Repti Breeze from Zoomed. Yeah. And this one is a Zilla cage. So Zilla has a cage as well. I forget what it's called. It might be called something. If you just type in Zilla screen cage, it'll come up. There's a name for it. They have a fancy name for it, but it is just simply like a frame with screen. And a lot of people say, hey, don't use screen for your day gecko because you're going to lose humidity. And like I said earlier, it's very cold here. So, the relative humidity in the rest of my apartment is probably around 6% today. So there's just no humidity in my apartment, but I keep this room relatively high. But the screen enclosure does work provided you have lots of live plants and you're fogging. So, I think one of the mistakes we make in the hobby is saying to maintain humidity, the best thing to do is just seal up all the vents, and that's where that's why people don't recommend screen enclosures, because there's too much ventilation. But ventilation is very good and very healthy for the animal. So the next step is figuring out how to maintain humidity with a well ventilated system. So that's kind of how I've done that. So if anyone just Googles Zilla screen cage, they'll find it.
Yeah, we've had that problem with some species of tarantulas, especially like, for instance, avicularia, which is commonly known as the pink-toe tarantula, essentially. It's one of the most common tarantulas, and it comes from the Caribbean. a lot of people, do a little bit of research on the environment they're from originally and see that it's very humid there. So they want to kind of emulate that environment in the enclosure, thinking, well, this needs to have 75, 80, 90% humidity all the time. And they essentially fall into the same trap. For years. We were seeing avicularias. They called it sudden avicularia death syndrome or something like that. SADS, because they were just dying and nobody could figure out why. And just, I guess, through years of experience and, asking questions, trying to figure out, well, how exactly did you have your enclosure set up? It turns out that a lot of those people were not providing enough ventilation in the enclosure because they were trying to spike the humidity and keep that up all the time. And it was making it to where, the tarantula was just in a very stuffy, stagnant environment that, it wasn't healthy for them and ended up killing a lot of them. So, it's trying to find that balance between humidity and ventilation. It seems to have, at least in the tarantula hobby, was a struggle for a while. It's just now finally starting to, good information is getting out. People are realizing that, at least for tarantulas, most species, humidity isn't nearly as important as having good ventilation.
Yeah, and I honestly think that's the case even for a lot of reptiles as well. We got stuck in this trap of taping up all the vents and holding humidity in and not really thinking about what that does for the environment in the enclosure. Like, you're creating an environment that just breeds bacteria and like you said, there's not going to be fresh air. So I do see that being sort of the next step in reptile equipment. I think we will start seeing more people using fans. I actually use a fan on one of my enclosures just to bring in fresh air. It only comes on at nighttime, only for a few minutes at a time, just to sort of freshen the air. And I think we're going to start seeing more of that. People, like you're saying, people are very afraid of losing humidity, but we don't want to increase humidity at the cost of good ventilation.
Are you talking about like a computer fan?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Like
sorry. Yeah.
Little squirrel bucks?
Yeah. Just a little computer fan. I've just kind of bolted on to my PVC enclosure that I have behind me. And yeah, so it just kind of comes on. It's on a Wi-Fi plug, so it comes on in the evenings and just freshens up the air. And and this is a Brazilian rainbow boa. These enclosures need to be 80 or 90% humidity, but I can still manage it as long as there's misting happening and the soil has enough humidity to continue to maintain where I need it to be.
So do all of your reptiles, are they all on the misting system that you have?
No, I just hand mist everything except for my day gecko. She's the one that gets misted all the time. She's on a timer mister, but everything else I just come through, just kind of like you at the end of the night. I'll come through and I'll mist and give everybody a little spike in the evening.
That's one of my biggest issues, I think, with keeping reptiles is just having to constantly monitor their temperatures and the humidities. And I don't even have anything really all that exotic. I've got a California king snake and an Eastern king snake. Those things they'll pretty much eat whenever, and they're pretty simple to take care of. And then my wife got a ball python, a banana calico ball python that I've pretty much been tasked with all of its care and husbandry. And so I'm not too stuck. And then somehow I've run into this issue. This is pretty much how I got my milk snake and how I got one of my geckos. I got a leopard gecko because I got a lot of enclosures for tarantulas, and one of the ways that I'm able to afford being in the hobby is Craigslist. So I go on Craigslist looking for people selling exoteras or pretty much any type of enclosure that'll work for tarantulas. And on more than one occasion, I've shown up to buy the enclosure, and turns out there's actually something living in it. And then they're like, "Well, you can have the snake, or you can have the gecko." And I'm like, "I don't want that. I just want the enclosure." And they're like, "Okay, well, we'll just let it go out back." And I'm like, "No, you can't do that. I'll take it." I've given a few of them away. My sister hates me because I pretty much anytime she comes up for Christmas, I'm giving her daughter. I give my niece some random reptile or something that a tree frog, or I gave her a leopard gecko. So I don't want this. It was given to me with the enclosure, so she enjoys it. So I just send it home with her.
Yeah, exactly. Like it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier. Like there's a lot of people who you get an animal because it seems like the right thing to do at the time, and then the novelty wears off, and then you have animals circulating Craigslist that just need new homes because the people don't want them anymore. So, they're all great. The people like you that will kind of absorb that, but it's like reptile rescues in general. I'm not sure what it's like in the tarantula hobby, but like rescues are full and maxed out in the reptile world. Are there there rescues for tarantulas, or what happens to those guys?
Not really. Occasionally you'll see somebody posting them on someone like Craigslist trying to sell them, and it seems to mainly be in the larger cities.
Mm.
Like I've never seen anyone trying to unload any kind of tarantula, and I'm pretty close to Pittsburgh. I mean, I was just in Pittsburgh last night. It's less than an hour away, so the Craigslist area or whatever it encompasses Pittsburgh, and occasionally I'll see some out there, but like in where I grew up, it's a little bit further south. Never did I see them, but I see people online posting screenshots of tarantulas. Occasionally they'll show up at the Humane Society.
Mm-hmm.
I've gotten a few people send me messages like, "Hey, there's a tarantula." But in those instances, anytime like the pound has a tarantula they're trying to adopt out, you can usually just tell by the picture it's a male that's mature and it's not going to live more than a few months. So
Right.
It's like, but there is up in Cleveland, not too far from me, is oh man, I can't remember the name. Animals Alive. It's a that's not right. I have to look it up. But it's there. I actually spoke to him at the North American Reptile Breeder Conference and found out they're just a few hours away from me. They're a reptile rescue, and they're constantly. It seems like they're taking in more reptiles than they're adopting out. So they're always trying to fundraise and get people to come pick up different reptiles, and occasionally they were telling me one instance somebody got arrested and was like going to prison, and they had a house full of tarantulas.
Oh my God.
So they ended up like bringing in 20 or 30 different species of tarantulas that they had to find somebody to adopt them out to. But it seems like there's more people, at least on Facebook, looking to adopt tarantulas because they don't want to spend the money on them. So if one comes up for adoption, it's usually gone faster than you can respond to the post.
Exactly.
But it seems like reptiles are the complete opposite, and maybe it's just because there's a lot more reptiles at your chain pet stores. People are impulse buying them and not realizing how much time and effort and money it takes to keep reptiles healthy.
But no, I think you're right. Like I think reptiles are more likely to be an impulse purchase rather than a tarantula. A tarantula obviously is going to be a smaller subset of the population that's going to do that. And I hate to rag on breeders, and I try not to, but one of the things that I think happens in the reptile industry is that once you've got into the hobby and you've had a few reptiles for maybe a few years, I think keepers feel like the next step is breeding. Like I already sort of advanced my husbandry, and now I'm comfortable caring for these animals, and I'm kind of bored of what I'm doing. So now I need a new challenge, and a lot of them reach to breeding for a new challenge. I think sometimes without fully considering the implications of the offspring. So it's like they're more focused on enjoying the breeding, which I totally understand. I imagine breeding is a lot of fun and it's exciting. But if there's no need for those animals to exist in your community, then you really shouldn't produce them. You should find another way to enjoy the hobby. So that process creates excess reptiles all the time, I think.
You see that a lot in the tarantula hobby as well, but a little different. I think some people get in. You got to buy an adult female, like we'll say, what am I trying to say? Poecilotheria metallica, the Goody sapphire ornamental, beautiful blue tarantula. You see a lot of viral videos of people, handling it or something like that, and they're usually really oversaturated. So people are like, "Wow, that's a bright blue tarantula," and you go to look to buy an adult female, and she's anywhere between $400 to $600. But then you see spiderlings are maybe only $50, and people like that little light goes off. It's like, this is an investment. I mean, I even fell victim to that. I used it more as an excuse to justify buying a lot of tarantulas to my wife. I was like, well, it's only a $20 or $30 spiderling, but when it's full grown adult, I could sell it for $300.
Yeah.
Not ever having any intention of ever selling a tarantula, but people kind of get into that mindset of, I can get a spiderling much cheaper than I can get an adult. So it's kind of like an investment. I can sell it off later if I want. And then they take that to the next step if they're selling these spiderlings for $40, $50 a piece, I could breed mine and, it'll produce a few hundred spiderlings and I'm going to be making thousands of dollars. And, so then you have like this influx of people that have never bred before, don't have an established business, breeding a bunch of tarantulas, having all of these spiderlings, trying to sell them on Facebook and stuff like that. And then the realization hits that that's like 300 mouths you have to feed,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and spiderlings are much more fragile and much more intensive in their care. So you really got to be checking on them every couple of days and feeding them and making sure that they have plenty of moisture, and just the hassle that comes with packaging and shipping and just advertising, letting people know you even have the slings to sell. So I see it a lot that people get really into breeding to try and turn a quick buck and help pay for their hobby, and just quickly become overwhelmed. And then, you know, we'll end up just wholesaling all of them to a actual tarantula dealer, but then being, you know, kind of upset about having to sell them at, like, realizing the difference in price between the retail and the wholesale is quite drastic.
Yeah.
It's a lot of effort, you know, it takes a lot of time and money to keep tarantulas alive when you have thousands of them that you're selling online. So it's always a sad thing to see.
It's a mistake I see lots of people make, and I think because it is kind of almost romanticized online. You see breeders online with big YouTube channels that are doing it like, this is my full-time job, I'm a reptile breeder, it's a dream job, which is great. I would never say that somebody shouldn't chase that. But at the end of the day, it's a business. So if you're not familiar with how to run a business, you might be surprised at how difficult, A, it is to run a business, and then B, how difficult it is to run a business, like you're saying, when your product eats, poops, and dies. So it's not like you're making shirts that you can stack into a box and hopefully sell. It's like your product is constantly eating away at your capital until you can move it. And you have people who've never even looked at a balance sheet before that are just like, I'm going to start a reptile breeding business and that's going to be my goal. Great goal, but maybe you should look at some business classes or understand the fundamentals of running a business before you think you can just pair two ball pythons and make a morph that's going to sell for thousands of dollars and that's going to be your business. It's much harder to do than I think some people make it seem, online especially.
Yeah, it's a little different in the tarantula hobby just because it seems like there's a lot of species that are rare because we don't have enough breeders. Mm-hmm. It seems to be that, you know, they'll whatever the hot species is, they'll be like, you know, or whatever the easiest is to breed. There will be tons of those available, you know, like something like a Nonduchromatus or Acanthoscuria geniculata, which are, you know, like kind of South American terrestrial tarantulas that have hundreds, sometimes thousands of babies in an egg sac, you know. So it's like you breed them once, there's plenty, and they're, you know, a staple in the hobby. But sometimes those slings are selling for $10, or they're just giving them away for free with every order, you know, stuff like that. And people can. Excuse me, people will breed those a lot just because they're easy and, you know, inexpensive. But then you have other more rare species that are, you know, it's more difficult to have a male and female that are mature at the same time and ready to breed, and then have the conditions. I mean, it goes into a lot of, it takes some skill and talent and experience to get those to breed. And, you know, so when it comes to those species, usually you see people are struggling to find people that are willing to breed them and being able to do it successfully.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not, I would say, at least in the tarantula hobby, there's a lot more of a deficit of species or breeders in the U.S. I guess I should also clarify that. When you go over to Europe, there seems to be a lot of people that are breeding and selling. I haven't quite wrapped my head around why it's that way, but they seem to have a much more stable and expansive set of breeders. Like a lot of the tarantulas that come into the U.S. or to North America are coming from Europe. They're getting imported in just because we don't have as many breeders that are doing it successfully here. I mean, it's starting to change, but, you know, it's just one of those weird things in the hobby.
Yeah.
But I see that a lot, and kind of like transitions into the next topic I was wanting to discuss is, you know, you've got a YouTube channel and you've got a podcast, and one of the things that kind of, when I was doing my research, I was running across a lot of YouTube channels, even met a couple of the guys from some of these YouTube channels at the North American Reptile Breeders Conference that have millions of subscribers. They're getting millions of views, and they're also, a few of them, I won't call anybody out by name, but they seem to be very controversial in their husbandry and their keeping and stuff like that. And I watch their channels, and it looks like they're having a whole lot of fun breeding reptiles, showing people, you know, they're selling them. It's, you know, their whole little business. But I think a lot of people kind of forget that you're watching a 10 or 15-minute YouTube video that's been heavily edited and intentionally recorded. So they're just showing you the good stuff. They're not
Exactly.
showing you cleaning poop for hours at a time or preparing, rats and mice to feed and all of the labor, doing the taxes, SEO, all that kind of like, building websites and stuff like that. All that boring stuff and the hard work doesn't make the cut for a YouTube video. So he gets glamorized.
Exactly.
I think a lot of people kind of get that concept that, oh, this is fun and this is easy. But I mean, why did you start a YouTube channel and podcast? Like, how did all this kind of come about for you?
Well, one thing I'll say before I answer that question is you have exactly that. It gets glamorized, and then people will say like, I want to breed snakes because I like animals more than I like people. And I always say, are you going to sell your snakes to other snakes? Like your business is going to have to revolve around people. You don't get to run a business that doesn't involve people. So that's something to think about. But as far as the channel, it kind of started randomly back in 2017. I was literally just starting to produce some kind of side income, and I was actually building websites that have nothing to do with reptiles, but I was really kind of getting bored doing that. So I thought, instead of just writing random websites and blog posts, it was like health-related things. I thought, why don't I just sink my teeth into something that I'm more passionate about, reptiles, and then just sort of see where it goes. So I started a blog, just writing kind of basic articles about care and feeding routines, and then I did a few sort of DIY things where I built a few enclosures, and that's kind of how YouTube got looped in. So I did a few tutorials and whatnot, and I did that for maybe like 7 or 8 months. But I eventually got to a point where I realized it's tough to continue to produce content unless you're getting a new animal. Like we kind of already talked about that, and that's one of the ways pet tubers produce content is they get a new animal, then they do the unboxing, the care guide, the enclosure setup, the update, and it's like almost like a fountain of youth as far as content is concerned. But I was not willing to do that. For one, I didn't have the space, and two, financially it didn't make any sense. It didn't make sense to continuously buy animals in hopes of producing a channel that would one day throw off cash. So that brought me to the podcast, and I realized I can actually. And at the time, I really didn't have a ton of experience keeping reptiles anyway. I had kept reptiles. I've done a few projects, but it wasn't like I felt comfortable giving husbandry advice. So I thought it makes more sense for me to bring somebody on to my YouTube channel and have a conversation with them and learn from them. And then my listeners can kind of go on that journey with me, the journey of improving husbandry. And so that's kind of how it started. Then I realized the podcast is a much better platform than just having YouTube. And the podcast is on both YouTube and any podcasting app. But that was sort of the genesis of it. And I was becoming very aware of the ethical implications of keeping exotic animals. Like I started to really question whether or not it was even right to be keeping these. Because I found a quote on a forum years ago. I have no clue who said it, but it was something like, the better your care, the more your animal will reward you with their fascinating natural behaviors. And it really made sense to me. So I started really dialing my care into better care, but sort of replicating nature better. But when you walk down that path too far, you eventually get to a point where you're like, well, if the best thing for my crested gecko is to have a slice of New Caledonia, maybe it would make more sense for it just to be there and not to be in my room. So that was the other sort of impetus for the podcast, was trying to discover if there was any good ethical reason to be keeping these animals. And that's sort of a journey I've taken the listeners on as well. So the podcast is more so, what can we do as keepers to improve the trade, make sure it's healthy, and also promote the areas of the hobby that are actually beneficial to both us and the animals, rather than just the us, basically.
That's a very interesting point. I like where you're going with that. We've had that same discussion, especially with a few very particular species in the tarantula hobby, just kind of about the ethics of, if a species is endangered, or, some of them are even, they're facing extinction, they're protected. And like recently, a whole bunch of Poecilotheria species have been put on the endangered, I don't know if it was endangered or threatened species list. It may have been like some in both, mainly because of partly just their habitat is being destroyed through, logging and urban sprawl and things of that nature, but also because they're being overcollected, and people are seeing that they're, selling for hundreds of dollars, for adults. So they're going out there and essentially poaching them and smuggling them out of the country and selling them in the pet trade. So there's been a huge movement of only buying captive bred specimens, like trying to get away from, getting anything that's wild caught. And in the U.S., it seems to happen more than I even realized initially. It wasn't up probably until the past few years I realized that a lot of times a faunopelma species that are adults that are being sold in the hobby, people are just going out their back door and going into that live down in Arizona or Texas and wherever they California, just the Southwest United States, finding these and just removing them and boxing them up. Same with scorpions. You see that a lot of wild caught scorpions and tarantulas from the Southwest are just essentially being collected and sold.
Yeah.
A lot of times people will have them up for sale and don't even actually have them. Like you buy them and then they go out and capture them, put them in a box and send them to you. So and I don't think that's as detrimental as some of the species in India or Brazil where, they're already in very low numbers and their habitat's being destroyed. But it's a good discussion that I think needs to be had in both hobbies, Yeah, because the other side of it is a lot of people feel like they're saving the species from extinction by having them established in the hobby.
Yeah.
And, I have to, part of me agrees with that as well. Like I don't want, different species of reptiles or arachnids removed from their native habitat for financial gain in the pet hobby. But at the same time, if the governments of those countries aren't doing anything to preserve that species in the wild, then, maybe having them established in the hobby and people breeding them and keeping them is going to keep them from being extinct. But
I totally agree. I mean, the concept of that invisible arc is still something that is worth, that is one of the benefits of the hobby, that we can kind of preserve some of these things. And I think, originally, so as I was starting to go down this path, one of the things, and we talked about this before we started recording, was I wanted to send some of my money that I was making from the hobby and give it to a charity that was actively conserving the rainforest. So I found this Amazon Rainforest Conservancy that's what they're called, Amazon Rainforest Conservancy. They're a charity out of Toronto, and they protect sections of the Peruvian Amazon rainforest. So I thought, that's perfect. A bunch of my animals are from that section of the world, roughly. So I could, give people information on these animals captively, and then as I make money, I can donate it to their wild counterparts. So that was kind of the way I was going to close that ethical loop. But when I first reached out to this charity, they basically said, "We don't want you to do that. We don't want anything to do with you." And it was because they weren't declining my donations, but they were declining my public donations. They didn't want me to publicly support the charity because they didn't like the way the reptile hobby looked. That's the way they perceived the mainstream reptile or exotic trade in general was negatively. Now we had a great conversation, and I eventually worked it out and basically to your point was like, if I didn't have these animals captive, I would have no interest in donating to a rainforest conservation because I wouldn't be, I get to look at a boa every single day. If I didn't, I wouldn't even think about donating. It wouldn't cross my mind. It's not because I'm evil. It's just it wouldn't cross my mind. So for sure, there are great benefits to having animals in captivity, and if there are sections of the world that are being completely decimated by, logging or whatever, that if we can pull those into the captivity and preserve them, that's very good. I think that's a total benefit, and that is one of the many benefits of keeping animals captive. But yeah, so there are some great benefits, but if we're not kind of focused on what they are, I think we can easily get misguided, right? Where you're saying like people are poaching for no reason. It's like there's a great reason to do wild caught tarantulas, but it's not just go into the backyard in California and grab one. That's not a good reason. But a good reason is, okay, in India they're destroying the rainforest, let's pull them and protect them that way. So I think it's just more guidance as far as what we are doing and the impact it's going to have.
Yeah, you're not the first person that's been on the podcast talking about conservation, saying essentially when they first reached out to whatever nonprofit organization they were, like, they had no interest in being involved with them.
Yeah,
and I understand, and that's one of the reasons I started this podcast. Is one, kind of like what you were talking about. Like I'm not an expert on anything really, so it's good to bring other people on that know a lot about their little niche. And and get other opinions. Like, I have my way of doing things and my opinions, the things that I've learned, but that's not the same as other people's experiences on, other things that they've studied. So it's good to kind of have that conversation and really highlight that there's more than one way to do things.
Mm-hmm.
There's more than one way of looking at things. And I've one of my goals with the Tarantula Collective and this podcast has been to kind of try and bridge that gap between the pet trade and researchers in the field, and between us as hobbyists and people in conservation, because it seems like we all are passionate about our whatever species, whether they're arachnids, tarantula, scorpions, or snakes or geckos or whatever it is. But there's a huge, even though we're all passionate about the same thing, there's a huge disconnect. We're like at odds with each other.
Mm-hmm.
People that are into conservation really don't seem to want to be involved with anyone that's seen as being in the pet trade. And the same with researchers. Like I've reached out to some researchers and they have no interest in discussing anything with somebody that keeps them as pets. They want to go out in the field and observe them in nature and leave them there, and I respect that. But I think it's important to kind of, because the people, like you were saying, the people that are into tarantulas they're learning about countries and cultures that they never would have given a second thought to, until they saw that tarantula and became fascinated with it and start researching, how it lives in nature, and just learning all kinds of things. And then that kind of inspires them to want to get involved in conservation, especially with a few Brazilian species and a couple species from India that, are facing extinction. You're seeing a lot of people wanting to get involved in conservation and help them. And it just doesn't seem to be very well received from people, which it is understandable. But yeah, trying to find some way to kind of bridge that gap, I think, is very important.
Well, yeah, and I think there are many, like you're saying, conservationists that are not keen on the hobby. And to those people, I always ask, where did you start your love for animals? Where did that start? Did that start in the field, wildly, looking at animals, or was it an interaction with a captive animal at the zoo or a pet that really sparked your love for the animals that you're now researching? And if the answer is in captivity in any capacity, then it's tough to just, burn that bridge and say, well, the captive animals are now pointless. It's like, you may not be doing what you're doing now had you not had an experience with a captive animal as a kid. And again, that's one of the great exotic, benefits of the exotic pet trade is we introduce kids and we give them a love for nature and a respect for wildlife in a captive setting, which you can't replicate that. You can replicate that in nature, but the likelihood of doing that is much smaller. Most people live in big cities. You're not going to be going out into the woods all the time. You can have that experience at a zoo or at someone's collection who keeps these animals in a way that allows them to display naturally, and that's going to be an experience that the kid won't forget. And the private keepers also are amazing at figuring out how to care for these animals. Like, the academics quite often will come to the hobby and say, we're doing a study on this animal. Can you help us care for it in the lab? Give us the care sheet, essentially. And the hobby is also great at figuring out how these animals breed, because we are totally unrestrained. We don't have bureaucracy or red tape to go through. Most of us are willing to spend way more money than we should on figuring out how this works, and we just kind of go and we just play mad scientist, not in a scientific way, but in a hobbyist way. And the academics will come to us and say, okay, how are you guys making these breed? Because we need to do this as well. So there's definitely bridges to be made between those two communities.
Yeah, I've actually worked with some research. Had someone reach out to me from a zoo, and still to this point, I am technically not allowed to talk about it in detail because that was one of the, we want your help, but we don't want to be associated with the pet trade at all. And also some of the research they were doing, just because of the grant funding and stuff, they didn't want that to be made public because they were afraid they would, somebody else would take their idea and run with it, and they'd end up losing their funding. So I kind of understand it. I really want to talk about it because it's cool. But I can say, they reached out to me and, asked some advice and for some specimens and told me what they were doing. And it's really exciting research, but it's one of those things that I was like, well, if you let me talk about this publicly, I could reach out to the members of my Facebook group, people that are watching YouTube, and get you a wide, like, essentially get you what you need, and you probably wouldn't even have to pay for it. Like, it kind of amazed me when they reached out, like, well, we'll give you this much, and I'm like, I don't want your money. Like, you can keep the money for the research. I would much rather, have the ability to do an interview with you. So that was kind of our trade. Once their research has gotten to a more stable place where they're confident in kind of publishing results, then I get to go and interview them and talk about it and talk about it publicly on my channel.
See, that's awesome. That's a perfect example. That's a perfect example.
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to that once the world starts getting back to a little more normal. You said something earlier though, something I kind of consider a dirty word. If I could say, you mentioned pet tuber, and it's one of those phrases or words that I really hate, especially when somebody uses it for me.
Yeah.
Like, describes me as a pet tuber. I'm like, no, because that's
the biggest insult
I think
possible.
there's a huge, yeah. And I'm not bashing any channel. Like, I'm going to try to be civil and not call anyone out by name, but there are a lot of YouTube channels that is their kind of their mode of operation is constantly getting new species, and like a wide variety. Some of them I've watched, it's like they have hedgehogs and snakes and other reptiles, but also tarantulas, and I mean, you name it. If it's a pet that's not a cat or a dog, they're going to add it to their collection. And I'm torn, like, and I want to see how you kind of fall on this subject. But part of me is appreciative that they have a big audience, and they're introducing their audience to these new species, and maybe driving some interest in pets or reptiles or arachnids that maybe have never really been given much attention shown. But at the other side of that kind of token is they're giving husbandry advice on an exotic pet that is wrong. So now millions of people think, well, this is how you keep this. Like, well, I'll speak from my experience. A tarantula. You have somebody that's known as a reptile YouTuber or a pet tuber that starts giving husbandry advice on a tarantula. Like, this is how you take care of a tarantula. This is how you set it up. And it's like, that is all extremely outdated information that hasn't been used in 20 years. Like, I want to say they're doing it intentionally, because I mean, they're not, but it just seems irresponsible. And then that hobby has to kind of go behind them and clean it up. And most of them, because they have such a large audience, they have no interest in hearing you correct them. You say something that's counter to what they're talking about in their video, and they just dismiss you or block you. I mean, where do you fall on pet tubers? Are they good or bad, or?
Well, there's a lot there. It's a good question. I typically see them as a negative, and the issue with YouTube, and I'm sure you know this very well because you have a very large YouTube channel, is it is an entertainment platform rather than an education platform. So the algorithm really pushes that entertainment value. So if you're someone like yourself who tries to straddle both worlds, like, you want to give good information, but you're basically forced to like really fine tune your filming and your editing and everything to make sure that you're at least giving good information, but trying to pull some eyes over from the random 14-year-old that has like 40 animals in his parents' basement, that's where the eyes head automatically. So that is an issue. And the other issue is people confuse large followings with competence in that world. And it's not just the reptile world. We see it all the time. You'll have like an Instagram channel that has 100,000 followers, and they're giving exercise advice, but really they're just showing pictures of their butt and they're collecting all these followers, and they don't know anything about exercise, but they're giving exercise. Like, I'm a swimming coach. That's sort of my before COVID, that's my job. And you hear this and you're like, wow, this is so wrong. But there's a sense of authority there because they have a large following. So that's an issue for sure. But I agree with you. What you're saying is that I can't necessarily fault the teenage kid or, someone who's creating this pet tube channel, because the allure of becoming successful on YouTube is a pretty strong gravitational pull. And you almost if you're not paying attention, you become like a caricature of yourself where you're just like willing to do like whatever possible to get those eyes on you. And that's sort of what I see happening. You have a YouTuber who's almost not even there anymore. It's just like they become an amoeba and they're willing to do whatever their audience wants to see. It's just like dance monkey basically. And that's essentially what happens. It's like, give us more animals. They're like, okay, I'll go out and I'll buy more animal. Here, look at this animal. And it's almost like they're not even there anymore. They're just sort of like, it's almost like a manifestation of the algorithm in itself. So it's tough you want to blame the kid, but at the same time, it's a much more deep problem, and it lies in the way YouTube functions. And yes, the husbandry advice they give is often horrible, and then even worse is they sort of set a precedent that having 50 exotic animals is normal, and if you do have that, you're actually pretty cool, which is also wrong. And we give people badges of honor for having massive collections, even though, like half the enclosures are dirty and there's water bowls that are empty, which is really bad as well. So it's almost like a societal issue. Like we've got to a point now where entertainment is the only thing and education is sort of at the wayside. It's very tough to compete in this domain when you're trying to be educational. So those are sort of my thoughts on it.
Yeah, that's something I've struggled with a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It's trying to ride that fence between education and entertainment, because it seems I get frustrated because it feels like I'm not pleasing anybody. Mm-hmm. I'll make one video and I'll get a lot of comments of people being like, "Oh, this is boring and too educational. We want to see this," and then the other side are people that are looking for educational content that are like, "Oh, it's too fancy and we just want to hear the facts," and so it's like, is this even worth it?
Yeah.
Like the people that just want the education are unhappy with me, and the people that want entertainment are upset I'm not doing more vlog style stuff and unboxings. And I haven't actually added a tarantula to my collection. I haven't bought a tarantula in I don't even know how many months now, probably coming up on a year. Have been lucky enough that some people are generous and dealers will send me some tarantulas to add to my collection or something like that. But I've had to kind of put my foot down in a lot of areas and be like, I already have that species. I don't need another one. Like, I appreciate you wanting to send it to me, but that's, I don't need it, and I don't want to just be a channel that's just constantly doing unboxings.
Yeah.
Because like you said, I think that really feeds into that kind of mindset that the more tarantulas you have, the better keeper you are.
Yeah.
And that's definitely not the case. And we've seen some very tragic things happen from people that had that mindset, where they just had mass deaths. They half their collection, or in a few instances, the entire collection ended up dying.
Wow.
Because they had so many tarantulas, they couldn't keep them, in whatever room they originally were in, and, put them somewhere else that, maybe lost electricity or something in the middle of the winter, and a bunch of them died. And it's sad, heartbreaking. And I think you see that, or they'll have an issue with their husbandry, and they've only been keeping for a few months, and they didn't realize, if they only had a couple tarantulas, then they would have been able to kind of identify that issue and resolve it. But they were so overwhelmed with the hundreds of species that issue had been replicated so much. By the time they realized there was an issue, there was already a wave of deaths kind of, going through their collection, and it was too late to stop it.
Right.
And I've made a lot of videos and even mentioned it in the podcast a few times that that's not the case. Your worth and your value as a keeper is not determined by the amount of species you have. And essentially, don't use me as an example. I'm a almost middle-aged man that, owns his own house and has absolutely no social life. So I have plenty of time to spend taking care of all these tarantulas. But if you're 20 and want to go out to the bars every night and have friends and go on trips and see the world, then you shouldn't do what I'm doing. That's not the lifestyle you want.
Yeah, and anybody who maintains a large collection properly gives that advice. It's because there are many people who have huge collections that do just an amazing job caring for them. It's obviously not the norm. It's the more of the exception. But anyone who does care for them well, like you're saying, it's just it's like a big warning, do not do this. You don't understand how much time I spend maintaining this in a healthy way. And, the chances of random kid being able to do that is probably pretty low. So it is tough. And I know exactly what you're talking about, where if you go a little bit too clickbaity, your education followers will get a little bit upset, and if you go, to education, then you're not going to get pumped into the algorithm because YouTube's not going to put you on the front page. So it's a tough game to play, that's for sure.
Yeah, and that's what I've spent a lot of time focused on, is studying the algorithm and how to make thumbnails and titles and just all of that kind of algorithm SEO stuff. And I test stuff, like that's something they suggest a lot is try different styles of thumbnails or titles and compare it against your original style and see how they perform. And I find myself sometimes having to fight against falling into that trap of pleasing the algorithm, because it's like, I know this type of video performs really well, but there's also very little educational content to it.
Yeah.
So it's like, I want to make that video to kind of, drive views to my channel and kind of help feed everything. But, there's also that, like, do I want to turn into a pet tuber?
Exactly.
Like, it's one of those, like, I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to just be doing unboxings and feeding videos. Right? And I enjoy watching those. I got nothing against it, but there's plenty of that out there. That's not why I got into YouTube. That's not why I started making videos. And it's hard to fight that desire to be successful.
Exactly.
If that makes any sense.
Well, it's a fine line, right? Like you want your audience to be engaged with the content, and you also want your audience to feel like they have a little bit of a say. Like, what do you guys like? What types of videos do you want to see? I think there's nothing wrong with that, but you want to take your audience's word with a grain of salt in a way. And it's not because you don't respect them. It's because if you just take en masse what they want, you will sort of begin to lose the sense of what you're doing or the purpose of your doing, and then you begin doing the dance monkey thing. And there's this quote, I don't even know if it's from Henry Ford, but at least I saw it was from Henry Ford, and I always think of it. The quote is, when Henry Ford said, if I would have asked the people what they would have wanted, they would have said faster horses, right? So it's like, you could ask the masses what they wanted, like, we want more horses. It's like, well, I'm actually building this car, which is going to be a lot better than horses. So sometimes the mass group is not going to give you the creative, nuanced idea. Actually, they'll never give you the creative, nuanced idea. That's why we have to, test out different things, and then they'll respond to it how they respond to it. But so yeah, it's a fine line between wanting to please them and also wanting them to feel engaged. You don't want your audience to feel like they're not involved in the process, because they absolutely are. They are a huge part of the channel, but you want to have the courage to try something completely out of nowhere just to see if it works and to progress things.
Yeah, I agree 100% there. Like, I tell people this a lot, at least other, tarantula YouTubers, is, they'll say to me that people in their comments or people are sending them messages saying they want these, specific types of videos. And I'm like, yes, but if you get 1,000 views and 10 comments, like, that's a very small fraction of the people that are watching your content that are being vocal about what they want.
Exactly.
So I, rely on analytics. That's not going to lie to you. Study, what people are actually clicking on and what they're actually viewing and how long they're viewing it, and use that as a more reliable kind of base to determine what type of content your audience actually does like, because a lot of people watch, but they, if they're not like really into the whole YouTube community, they don't realize the importance of leaving a comment or hitting the like button and how that affects the algorithm and the success of videos. So they're watching it, they're enjoying it, and you're not going to have any feedback from them whatsoever, other than the analytics that are provided, on the back end. So, trust that more than anything.
Yeah, that's a great
And
point.
I found that, like on my own channel, people will be asking a whole lot for a feeding video, because I maybe do a feeding video every 3 or 6 months. It's not a common occurrence. So I'll make one, and that video just doesn't perform nearly as well as, a more educational video sometimes. And it's nobody asked for top 10 lists, but every time I do a top 10 list, it seems to go really well.
Mm-hmm.
And I just did a video, I just released yesterday, actually. It was just kind of about, just changes in the hobby, how things have changed in the tarantula hobby the past 5 years. Like, it's, I don't know how, from an outsider's perspective, how if you've noticed any difference, but the hobby's like blowing up. Like, it's just started all of a sudden gaining a lot of, just a lot more people are keeping tarantulas, and a lot more. I mean, Zilla, I think it was Zilla, finally came out with enclosures built specifically for inverts. It's like, been waiting on that for decades.
Wow, that's so true. I guess, there never has been. Hey, it's always been just like pick up the scraps and figure out how to do it yourself.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, some of the big retailers are actually carrying tarantulas and carrying products for tarantulas, and you got businesses popping up that are making substrates and enclosures solely for tarantulas and inverts. And it's like a business like that wouldn't have been viable, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And so that means that, there's more demand for that kind of product finally. And that also means that the hobby's really kind of grown in popularity and acceptance. And it's really exciting, but it's also has some negative consequences. You have, bad advice going around, or people only finding old advice. Like, that's one of my biggest frustrations with YouTube, is that it's not just the entertainment channels that get pushed a lot. It's videos that have millions of views because they've been on YouTube for 15 years are the first things that pop up in search algorithms sometimes. And, there'll be some guy talking about how to keep a tarantula for a beginner. And it's like, that was bad advice 15 years ago when he made the video. Like, now it's completely outdated. So, how you got to play the algorithm just to get your content like correct. Like that's kind of the game I play, is trying to be entertaining enough. And I don't like the word clickbait because I try not to be clickbaity, but at least be intriguing enough that people will click on the video, so that good information starts rising to the top a little bit more. I mean, that's a battle.
Exactly. Well, and I think maybe this is just me being hopefully biased, but I do think that in the next 4 or 5 years, maybe even shorter, we will start seeing a collapse on that entertainment side. Because there's no substance there, and I think people eventually will get tired of that, just being tricked by clickbait and seeing all these, like this whole TikTok phenomena where things are changing on the screen every 5 seconds to keep the person engaged. I don't know how long that can go on for, because eventually there's no substance holding that stuff up. It's not like there's research behind it, or you're not giving anybody good quality information from experience. It's just like random stuff all the time. So my hope is that the channels that have been really focusing on more quality information, and not necessarily accurate. Sometimes we aren't accurate. We give information that is to the best of our knowledge right now, but we're constantly keeping that open mindset where you're progressing and learning and tinkering, kind of doing that like at-home science type stuff. I hope that eventually those channels start to take over, and then maybe the algorithm will start pointing towards that direction, because the algorithm right now has no ability to judge the quality of the information being provided. It just can't, and I don't know how they could eventually do that, but maybe I assume that eventually Google will figure out a way to do that so they can understand what information is being given and whether or not it's good or bad, which, I mean, opens up a whole other can of worms, but that's just my hope.
Yeah. I hope the robot overlords take over
exactly.
a little more. Yeah, there was a YouTuber, and I guess they're a pet tuber. They seem to mainly keep, and I'm not bashing your hobby at all, but there's a lot of reptile keepers that have YouTube channels that get some pet tarantulas and make videos. Mm-hmm. Like the day they receive their first tarantula, make a video on how to care for it.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of like, that's pretty ballsy, man. Like, I wouldn't I have snakes. I've never made a care video on them because I don't have the experience I feel like is necessary to do that. And you literally said minute 1 in your video, this is my first tarantula. Yeah. And at minute 3, you're saying, this is exactly how you take care of it. And it's like, that always rubs me the wrong way. Mm-hmm. And it seems to happen mainly from reptiles.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because if you're not keeping a lot of reptiles, you might not pick up on it as well. But all the husbandry that they're saying about the reptiles are usually way off and outdated and just bizarre as well. So it's not like they're kind of missing on the tarantula but doing well on the reptiles. It's like it's a hit the ditch the whole way, basically.
It's a good point. I didn't even think about it from that aspect.
Yeah,
and I've met some of these people before, like at expos and stuff, and they're nice people. Mm-hmm. But it's also very evident that they are interested in being famous on YouTube, being a social influencer, more than they are interested in providing good information or proper information. It's to them, this is just something fun that I do that I'm getting attention for, not so much as like I'm concerned about the well-being of these species and kind of propagating correct information.
Well, that is one of the tropes that I'll sometimes get from people, is that you're overanalyzing things. You're taking the husbandry too far. who are you to say that if a person is caring for the animal and it's making them happy, that who are you to say that they're doing it wrong? It's like, well, being happy and being enjoying what you're doing has nothing to do with the welfare of the animal. The welfare of the animal has to come first, because you have an animal that has sacrificed its freedom. And yeah, being in the wild isn't sunshines and rainbows. Obviously, there's lots of bad things that happen in the wild, but giving up your freedom is a significant thing to give up. And just to say, because I'm enjoying the way I'm caring for it, so I shouldn't be obligated to look into better and more detailed information, is a total cop-out. And that's one of the things I always get. Well, I really like caring this way. It's fun. It's like, well, you should have a pet rock then, because what you are caring for is an actual biological being that has life. And if you tried to kill it right now, it would actually fight for its life. So it's not insignificant in any stretch of the imagination. And I think we tend to weigh our own enjoyment more than anything else, when actually the most enjoyment and the most purpose and the most fulfilling aspect of caring for captive animals is doing a good job, because you get to watch them behave naturally, and you get that enjoyment of setting up the enclosure and doing the research and learning about that native part of the world where they come from. It's not about, throwing it in the enclosure and just being excited when it eats crickets, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. And I think that's one of the big differences between the reptile side of the exotic pet hobby and the invert side is, I've noticed, like, my snakes need a lot of room to move around and explore and burrow and be snakes. Whereas a tarantula, whether it's in my basement or it's out in the wild, has a very small area that it considers its territory. And some species of tarantulas, they'll make their burrow and never, unless they're a male searching for a female, they don't really ever leave more than like a 1 or 2 foot area. Like they stay at their home base and spend their entire lives there. So the enclosures that are needed, they don't like a 20-gallon aquarium is way overkill for almost any species of tarantula. Like and I think that's also what kind of leads to people getting so many species, is that they don't need that much space. And you end up buying a shelf and like, well, I got to fill the shelf and, with enclosures so it looks balanced or whatever, bullcrap you feed yourself. But yeah, it's interesting to see people leaving comments that are from the reptile hobby or just don't keep pets at all, and see a tarantula in an enclosure that they feel like is small. Like, you're keeping that poor spider trapped in this tiny little box. And it's like, well, I mean, yes, it's trapped. Like, I got a lid on it, but even if it was, in the jungle, it's not going to be using any more space than it is right now. Mm-hmm. Like they're kind of opportunistic feeders that sit there for weeks waiting for something to cross their path. They're not going out hunting for it. So trying to educate people on that aspect, it can sometimes be challenging.
Well, yeah, and also, I mean, proportionally, like tarantulas are quite small for the most part as far as the volume of space that they take up. So even if you have what looks to be a small enclosure, that tarantula still has space if it wanted to move around. Like you're saying, most of the time it's going to be burrowed, it's not going to move. But I mean, in the reptile hobby, we see enclosures that a snake can only fit in it 10 times, for example, and it will be full. For like if you took the volume of the snake and then times the amount of the volume of the tub, it's minuscule and there's no space for the snake to roam around. Or in a tarantula, I bet even in a small, what someone might consider a small enclosure, you're probably still fitting that actual small spider in that enclosure several times if you filled it top to bottom with the same size of spider over and over again, if you know what I mean. So
it's a creepy visual, man.
So I think as the reptile hobby is way on the other side with being tiny little enclosures. Like we have many people keeping in much too small enclosures, and like you were saying, you see the animals wanting to roam. They come up, they're rubbing the door or rubbing the lip of the tub because they want a little bit more space. And that's where the nuance comes in of caring for the animal. Like if you keep a tarantula and you never see it, I mean, I don't keep them, so I don't know how much they would investigate like openings or whatever. But if it looked like it needed more space, I'm sure somebody would provide it more space. If it was a spider that happened to be, one that was a little more nomadic, maybe. I'm not sure if there are any in the hobby, but it's easy to tell when a snake wants more space. It's just, it's really, like I have a boa right now who definitely needs a larger enclosure because she's constantly she's rubbing against the door. She wants out, and a lot of times I let her out and just move around because they want that freedom and that space to move. So that's one area that I'd love to see the reptile hobby take more seriously. It is giving the animals some more space. And that just comes based off of reading the animal's behavior.
Yeah, that's true. You do see some people that kind of take it to the other extreme and are keeping tarantulas in enclosures that are much too small. But usually that's a time issue, that they've gotten over their head and they don't have the time or the money to buy a new enclosure and, rehouse that into a more appropriate size space. But yeah, for the most part, like I've got some trapdoor spiders, and even though the enclosure seems pretty small, it's probably too big for them because they never leave that little burrow they've made. They pop out for half a second to grab prey, and then they're back down in there.
Yeah.
So I mean, what's important is having plenty of depth for them to burrow deep and make their tunnels. But they're not out wandering ever. If they're out, it's usually a sign that something's wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's you see this a lot. At least in the tarantula hobby, is people they get introduced to arachnids because initially they had a snake or a gecko, and they got kind of plugged into the exotic pet hobby. They see somebody selling them at a pet show, or they see some YouTube videos and decide, I want to get a tarantula, add that to my collection. But they have a reptile keeper's mindset where they it needs plenty of room to move around. It needs a heat lamp. It needs heat pads. I gotta be obsessed with temperatures and humidity and stuff like that. And trying to break people of that sometimes can be challenging because it's it's a tarantula, and even if it comes from an environment that's along the equator that gets up to average temps of 90 degrees, that just means that it's 100 degrees sometimes during the day, and then at night it's 60 or 70 degrees, and when it's really hot, the tarantula will hide, and if it's an arboreal tarantula, it hides somewhere that's shady, like inside of a tree, where it's not exposed to that heat. Or in the desert, a lot of those tarantulas will burrow deep into ground to escape the heat of the day, and they come out at night when it's much cooler. So thinking that, it's 100 degrees in the desert in the Southwest or in Mexico, I need to make sure my enclosure's that temperature all the time. It's no, that's going to kill them because you're not providing them the ability to escape the heat like they would in nature. And trying to explain to people that are used to keeping reptiles, it's no, that they don't bask, they don't need UVB light. When it was sunny outside, they're hiding in nature, so they actually do better when it's kind of darker and room temperature. That seems to be where most species thrive. They're very low maintenance.
Well, I think it's actually a mistake that reptile keepers make as well, is that they will they'll get a reptile, and then they'll look for the place in the world where it's from. And then they'll analyze the climate of that capital city of where that's from. And it doesn't give you it's a starting point, but it doesn't give you exactly what you're looking for, because all these animals, including inverts and reptiles, typically occupy very small ecological niches, right? In the wild, they have, yes, maybe the desert's getting to 110 degrees, but like you said, they're not out in that temperature. So it's important to know where they're from, but then it's also very, very important to understand at what part of the ecosystem are they using. Are they forest dwelling? Are they in the rainforest when there's basically no diffuse light, or there's just very little diffuse light down there? Are they burrowing? Are they climbing? There are so many more questions than just basically what's the weather in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro today. That's not exactly what you want to use to replicate your reptile or your inverts enclosure.
Yeah, I feel you there. And there's also this kind of new movement, I think, is a good way, a fad in the tarantula hobby, or inverts. And I mean, it could be I'm actually doing it with my scorpions. I've seen a lot of people doing it with scorpions and isopods and tailless whip scorpions, vingaroons. Is the bioactive setups, bioactive enclosures, are starting to become very popular. And it's a double-edged sword there as well when it comes to inverts, because one, they're beautiful to look at, seeing all the plants growing, have an actual living kind of bioactive enclosure. And it emulates kind of their natural environment. So you do get to see them act a little, behave more naturally than they would if they were just in a plastic shoebox or something. But that also means now you have to have lights, and you have to have, you got to be careful with, the amount of humidity, because some species, they're arid species. They don't do well when there's a lot of the humidity or the moisture in the soil that would enable a plant to grow is too much for the tarantula. So to trying to balance that bioactive, the desire to have a bioactive enclosure with some of these species has actually kind of been detrimental. Now, some of them have thrived, like I've got a Carabiner versicolor that I've gotten a paludarium set up, and it's kind of experimenting. Like, I don't know if this is a good idea or not, to be 100% honest, but it's you got are you familiar with the paludariums?
Yeah.
They have like the water on the bottom and then like a little platform with dirt, and I've got some plants growing in there because it's one of those species that can do well in higher humidity, but also needs plenty of ventilation. So I'm kind of just trying this out, see how this bioactive works. Mainly just because I think those enclosures were really cool. It was more, it was not so much this species needs a paludarium. It was more like, I really like the way the paludarium looks. Is there a species of tarantula that will thrive in this enclosure?
So is there any risks with having a large body of water with the tarantula there, or?
No, especially like Avicularia and Carabiner, they've actually been seen swimming in the wild.
Cool.
Like if they fall out of a tree, they float. They don't drown or anything, and they just start kicking their legs. And they don't like swim naturally. Like, I don't think it's something they go out and do, but they have been documented in nature. Falling into trees or trying to cross a creek and just kind of jumping in the water and swimming across to the other side.
Oh, cool.
So it's and they don't. It's one of those things that it's arboreal, so it's never on the ground anyways. So if it were to fall into the water feature, it would be because it did something clumsy and fell, but it would quickly get itself back up. But I mean, I've had mine in there. It's actually right here behind me. I think you can even see her on the glass there. That's pretty much where she hangs out. She's just gonna, is always up top, just now starting to web. But my biggest worry is not so much the water as it is the light, because they do prefer, when it's really bright outside, they're hiding in the shade. So I worry that I got too much light on it and I'm going to stress it out, which is usually the opposite with most reptiles.
Yeah, no, that's so true. Yeah, you'd have to set it up in a way where there's plenty of areas where there's just lots of shade, and in the reptile side, I think bioactive is still also a double-edged sword, because like you said, it has become a bit of a fad word, and people just get a reptile and throw like 10 isopods in the enclosure, and then they call it a bioactive setup, and then they don't clean it and they don't do anything for maintenance. It's like a bioactive setup is really, it can be a lot of work. It's supposed to be kind of a project that continues on forever. It's not just 5 isopods. So I keep a couple of reptiles in bioactive setups. My other ones are not. I do have live plants and whatnot, but they're potted, so I don't have isopods. I still spot clean. I'll clean up the enclosures that way. So, I mean, we did an episode of my podcast, I think in December, and it was, talking about, is bioactive necessary? And I think it's a great tool, and it can be lots of fun if you're doing it right. But I think in the exact same ways it sounds like it's in the invert hobby, is people just jump into it and assume that their care is better because they're bioactive, when in reality, it's probably the animal's probably worse off now because they're now in like a mold, mildew environment with way too much light and critters crawling around. So it definitely is not as easy as I think some people think or make it out to be anyway.
I actually I've talked about this before on the podcast. I set my leopard geckos up in bioactive enclosures, mainly because I was having issues with the like when they would shed. They weren't really getting good sheds. Like, I didn't have, even though I had the humid hides and everything, I just was struggling. So somebody had suggested try the bioactive setup. And since I've done that, I haven't had any issues. They seem to be out a lot more, especially in the evenings, hunting prey and just exploring. They seem, from my limited knowledge, to be a lot happier, and they're not having the issues with shedding that they had. But I think I've been kicked out of a few leopard gecko groups on Facebook because I mentioned I kept him bioactive, and they're like, "No, you got to keep him on paper towels or tile."
Yeah.
I'm like, okay.
Is the tarantula world like that on Facebook as well? Because a reptile world is like an actual dumpster fire for most of the Facebook groups.
Yeah, it's funny because I'll complain about the toxicity of tarantula or invert Facebook groups, and people are like, "Yeah, but it's nothing like reptiles." So I think it's bad, but it's not nearly as bad as your like gecko and ball python groups, it seems.
Oh, they're crazy, man. It's just wild. It is so wild in there. using tactics and care methods that we've been doing since 1992 and defending those like it's the last thing you're ever going to do. And there's just no open-mindedness, no flexibility, and in a lot of ways, it's very pointless.
Yeah, that was the video I just came out with was about trying to remain more open-minded in the hobby, because I think a lot of us fall into that trap. It's, we'll have our way of doing stuff that works well and kind of convince ourselves that everybody needs to do it that way. And we're not taking into consideration different, like I talk to people in the Philippines or, some South American countries, and, they're talking to get an exoteric enclosure is like 3 to 4 times as expensive in their country as it would be for us to go to the pet store and pick one up here. Just because the cost of shipping and, just the demand isn't as high as it would be in other countries that are larger. So they're like, I can't keep it in a fancy enclosure because we're in a small country and so we have to use plastic containers, like jugs and stuff like that. We have to, it's very do it yourself, make it what you can. And they'll post pictures on Facebook, and people, without even taking into consideration where in the world that person lives, just start, destroying them. Yeah. Like, you're a terrible keeper because you're not using this type of enclosure. And they're like, well, I don't have access to that type of enclosure, dude. How am I supposed to do that? So and there was for a long time, it seemed cocoa fiber was what the substrate that you use for tarantulas. And some people are very hesitant about using any other type of substrate now, but it's like, I remember 20 years ago, nobody used cocoa fiber. Really, it was vermiculate. Some people kept tarantulas on gravel or, bark. Like I went to a lot of pet stores and they kept tarantulas like on reptile bark. And it's like, they can't burrow in that. They can't do anything. It's not a good substrate for them. But back then it was considered proper husbandry. Keeping a incandescent light over top of a tarantula was considered proper husbandry. And as the decades have progressed, time's gone on, we've learned how to do things better. But it seems every time somebody comes out with a new way of doing something or a new substrate or a new type of enclosure, you've got those people that, are set in their ways about how they're doing it now and have no interest in changing, and won't be quiet about it.
Exactly.
They want to go on and ridicule anybody that's trying something new and trying something different.
Like, I think there's so much power in allowing people to experiment with what they're doing. And yes, I guess you could say that you may be risking the animal in a little bit more than you might if you stayed in the status quo style care. But actually, I don't mind that as long as the keeper's paying attention to what they're doing. They're trying things. Like, I have, one of my friends has started to cohab leopard geckos as an experiment, and he's an incredibly smart kid, and he's just like done all the research, and he's set this thing up in a way, and he's spending the time making sure that it doesn't go wrong. Of course, people went crazy when he suggested this, but it's still like, that's the only way we can progress in both hobbies, is allowing people to experiment outside of the norm. Like, it's one of the reasons professors at universities get tenure, because then that allows them to literally do any experiment they want without having the risk of being fired. Like, they don't have the bureaucracy saying, hey, that's a really stupid idea, you should not do that. They can say, I've spent this much time establishing myself, and now I can do anything I want that sounds out of the box just to see if it works. And there is a concept in the hobby that I think we want to keep alive. And yeah, but Facebook is where those ideas go to die, because somebody will say, hey, I'm thinking about trying this, and they come out with their pitchforks and their torches and burn them until they disappear. And so I try to stay away from most Facebook groups, because it doesn't you end up wasting your entire day in a keyboard battle, and you feel horrible at the end of it.
Yeah, and nothing is accomplished. You didn't change their mind. They didn't change your mind. Like, I created a Facebook group before I even started a YouTube channel, because I wanted to create a space where we could be more open-minded and not have as many trolls in the comments and kind of discuss things. And I was able to do that for about a year. But as the group grew, like now it's like up almost to 20,000 members. And it's like, it's impossible to, I think like right now there's like 25 moderators in the group. But even with them constantly being in, just being moderators, they're not able to see everything. And it's always disturbing and disheartening when you see some of the comments and posts and people just, getting really, really mad and attacking people personally and saying some stuff that's like, you wouldn't say that to anybody you met in person. Like, you wouldn't say that to somebody's face you disagreed with. Why do you feel like it's okay to do it in the comments here? But one of the philosophies I've adopted is that if I run across somebody like that on especially Facebook, I don't engage them. I just block them.
Yeah.
Kind of creating my own echo chamber in some ways, but it's like, if you're just all negativity and ignorance, then I'm just not even going to deal with you.
Yeah, it's total
I do that
waste
on
of
YouTube
time.
too. Somebody, yeah, it's like I got no time to try and change your mind because I'm not going to be able to. Like, you're dead set in your way, and obviously we disagree on whatever this topic is. So let's just go our separate ways.
Yeah.
But like I recently, like, as yesterday, what is today? Today's Wednesday. So yesterday I got officially laid off from my job, and mainly essentially because of COVID. Like, where I was a small business. Essentially, my friend started a business. I've been working for him for about 5 years, and it just kind of got to the point. One, I was focusing so much on like this podcast and the YouTube channel and just the website, just kind of trying to build this business. And I had, it was a struggle because I was working on this 40 hours a week and then working for him 45 hours a week. And my wife and kid were like, we're here too. Like, you could spend some time with us. And so I decided I'll cut back, 3 days a week, working like 36 hours a week. And that would give me a little more time to focus on this. So I had more time to, like, do stuff with my family. And that I was starting to like kind of achieve a balance there, both financially and, with my time. And then this happened, and he's just like, I'm sorry, I can't afford to pay you to work anymore. Like, it's just, we're just not doing the business. So I got to do this by myself for a while. So I got laid off, and so now this is like my prime source of income, like just money I get from advertisers or YouTube ad revenue. And it's terrifying because it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier, that desire, that temptation to feed, like, to go with the algorithm just to get views, to make more money is more, I don't know. It's more powerful than ever right now, at least today. Like, I'm like trying to figure out what videos to make next, and then fighting with myself about not doing something just for views. But like, do you run into issues like that being a podcaster and YouTuber?
Yeah, I would say I definitely do. And it's it's funny how much the dynamic changes because I'm sort of in the same position as you, where I'm laid off as well with kind of I don't know when life will, job will come back. And it's funny how different the whole podcast and YouTube channel feel once your job is gone. And all of a sudden it's like, wow, this is way more serious than it used to feel. And in some ways I like it because I have more time and I can really, have more direction. But then in other times I'm like, I wish I could just get a normal paycheck for once, and this can go back to being a type of a hobby. But yeah, for sure, kind of getting back to the pet tubing side is there's nothing more frustrating than spending like hours and hours either editing a podcast or producing a video and filming and editing and then, putting out what I think would be really good information, spending time reading papers and trying to present good information. And then, that get, 1,200, 1,500 views. And then you have the pet tuber who got a new hamster get, 50,000, 100,000 views. And that money is just, I could use that money. so you do struggle with wanting to play that game a little bit. And it is challenging. And especially like we're saying now, like if you cut the paycheck off from the job, then it's like, you almost just want to like abandon all your morals and just do whatever it is to make the money. But I always go by this quote that nothing well done is a waste. So as long as I'm putting the time and the energy into it, maybe it doesn't pay off today, but maybe it pays off in a year from now. Maybe in a year from now, this makes sense. And all this foundation that I've laid is worth it. And because it does sometimes feel like you should just go the crazy clickbait route, but I just think I think that has less shelf life, and that's kind of what I convinced myself to stay positive.
I think that's a very good outlook. I mean, like even TikTok is starting to realize these 15, 60-second videos aren't going to sustain us much longer, and they're starting to roll out 3-minute videos. Before you know it, they'll just be another YouTube.
Exactly.
A vertical YouTube. But yeah, so you have a lot of different people on your podcast. I was checking out your website last night and just kind of going through all of you kind of do something similar to this, right? Like you have guests on and you're discussing different topics. can you just kind of tell the listeners of this podcast like what they can expect if they go check out yours? Like what kind of stuff you got going on?
Yeah, so the podcast is mainly focused on reptile keeping, and at this point, I've sort of turned it into a bit of a network. So there's the network is called Animals at Home Network, and my show on that network is the Animals at Home podcast, and we have another show on there called Animals Everywhere, which is hosted by Bryce Broom, who is a venomous keeper in South Africa. He's got a really cool show, but my show is mostly focused on the reptile hobby, and then so the guests range from YouTubers to manufacturers who are like Arcadia, who are big reptile supply company, lots of researchers and biologists and zookeepers, lots of just everyday keepers. So, and really the focus is what are ways that we can progress the hobby forward. So, and that's where I think I have a very wide audience. It's not like I just have a band of bioactive keepers who are obsessed with advancing care. I have those people, but then I have all the way down to people who are breeding morphs and racks, who I always say that I'm not for that. It's not my style of keeping. But everybody's interested in learning how to be better at the hobby and progress their care. And if there's one thing you can do better, what is it? And that's sort of what the podcast analyzes. So yeah, we've had I'm trying to think names off the top of my head. Lots of different YouTube channels that people would recognize. Like we were saying before, we had Zach Loafman on as well, who is a researcher in West Virginia, who we did a great episode on just using natural history to understand how to build your husbandry protocols. We've had zookeepers. For some reason, when I'm starting to think of the names, it's not coming to my head. I just had Tom Crutchfield on, who is obviously a fairly well-known reptile. I don't know what we call him, a mogul. He's been around the hobby for a long time. That was a really fun episode to record, and there's just kind of a wide variety of things.
Yes, I saw that you had Adam Wickens on your podcast. I haven't had a chance to listen to it yet, but I enjoy his YouTube channel. He's really kind of been taken off here lately.
He has a great ability to present information. His videos are well presented and well edited, and he holds attention very well. And kind of like you were saying before, people love lists, and that's kind of what he's figured out. And he's just kind of put the pedal to the metal in that niche, and it's done really well for him.
Yeah, he and I are actually going to do a collaboration in the next month or two.
Oh, cool!
So I'm kind of excited about that. But he's also from Canada, right?
Yeah, he's in Ontario, so he's close. I think he's close to the Niagara Falls internet. Or what do you guys Niagara Falls is our side. I forget what it's called. Oh, Horseshoe Falls. If people are familiar with Horseshoe Falls, maybe not. It's a giant big waterfall.
Yeah. I always just called it Niagara Falls, but.
Oh, you do? Okay, yeah. So that's where he's kind of from.
Yeah. Okay, that's cool. So mainly your podcast is discussing husbandry and conservation and things of that nature. Is your YouTube channel similar? Is it just video versions of the podcast, or do you put other types of videos?
The YouTube channel has video versions of the podcast, so that's where I post it. But I also do like my own videos as well, where I'll just do, like today I'm doing some upgrades on this enclosure, so I'll walk people through that, and then I'll do random topics like I was talking about that hedonics treadmill effect of getting addicted to buying reptiles. So I'll do like a 10-minute video on something like that. I've recently started doing. People have been sending me photos of their enclosures, and I've been kind of reviewing those and taking a look at those, which has been a lot of fun because some people are just unbelievably creative, and it's really fun to share those ideas with everybody. And yeah, the podcast itself, we focus. There are certain things about reptile care that we're starting to learn now, like the importance of lighting, like we were already talking about, the importance of visible light and UV, and now we're really realizing the importance of infrared light. So I've had people coming on and talking about that, and there's just little aspects of the hobby that we can slowly step forward, and those are the topics that I like to kind of pick apart and have people, because I'm just learning like everybody else, so I get to have these conversations with these people that are way smarter than me, and the listeners can kind of come along for that ride.
So what is your goals this year as far as your content creation?
It's a good question. I want to I need to find a better way to do more videos. So I want to continue making videos without stepping into that pet tube reality. So I want to be more consistent there, and because it is tough. Maybe you'll recognize this as well because you have a separate channel for your podcast. Those videos don't do great on the analytics side when you post an entire podcast because the retention rate is so low, the click-through rate is low. It's like if you want to damage your analytics, post podcast on your YouTube channel. So I'm loving the podcast. I do think it is very new, and I think there's tons of space for this medium to grow. I think this is going to pay off in the future. But I also want to do a little bit more videos and just break down topics a little bit that don't need a whole podcast. Like I really want to do a video on. Well, one thing I'm going to cover at some point is the spider ball python gene, which I know people will hate, but I want to really dig into that a little bit more and really understand where morphs come from, like sort of on a genetic level. So that might be maybe like a 20-minute video rather than a whole podcast. So I want more shorter videos that have like little bits of information rather than the full podcast. And so I would say that's my goal, to continuously producing those, and then just keep working on the podcast. The podcast, as you know, is a lot of work. Finding guests, doing research, and doing the interviews is definitely time consuming. But like I said, I think we're still in the infancy with this format, and people are going to catch on, and it's going to be something that's going to kind of blow up in the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. You mentioned, well, first off, how can people find your podcast? What's the easiest way?
So even if you just go to Google and type "animals at home," you'll find my website. But if you go to animalsathome.ca, you can find the website, or just go to Google animals at not Google, go to YouTube, type in "animals at home," and you'll find it there. And I have the website for the network itself is animalsathomenetwork.com. But you'll find it in any podcasting app as well if you just search that. So Spotify, Apple, whatever other ones are out there.
Awesome. Now, I don't want to jump into anything too deep here, but for people, a lot of my listeners, that they're mainly just keep inverts. So I've heard a lot that this spider morph gene or whatever, a very controversial topic with ball python keepers. Can you just give us like a very brief explanation as to what it is and why it's so controversial?
Well, on the face of it, the issue is when we mess with the phenotype of an animal. In other words, when we genetically breed things to look different on the outside, we inevitably make alterations to other tissues within the body. And that's what we really don't have a great concept of. It's just something we've sort of just let it rip at this point, and we've just continued to breed animals that look cool without really understanding the significance of what we're doing. So with the spider gene, but also many other ball python genes, there's certain things like neurological disorders come with it. So there's this famous spider wobble. So you have a spider ball python that will have a little bit of a tremor in its head. Sometimes it's super insignificant. Sometimes it's fairly insignificant. But the question is whether or not we should be doing that. And people who are pro-spider think that it's totally fine and we shouldn't worry about it. And for the most part, these animals are totally healthy in captivity. And then you have people who think taking the risk is of producing animals that have the chance of having a neurological disorder is not worth it. So I really want to go into where are these morphs coming from? What alterations are we making in the body of the animal that's leading to these neurological disorders? So in a nutshell, that is kind of the basic of the conversation. Ball python breeders defend it like crazy. They get obsessed with this topic, and they usually get pretty mad. So I'm probably in for a little bit of hate mail when I go through it, but it'll be interesting.
Has there been any genetic testing or anything on a very scientific level?
Not really. Like there's a little bit. If you ask most people breeding morphs, they won't have a good understanding of what is actually happening. The melanocytes are the cells in the skin that change the color of the snake, as well as us in humans. But those cells do not only contribute to skin color, they also are found in like eye tissue, lung tissue, several different tissues within the body. So the question is when we make those genetic alterations, what other downstream effects do we have? And so, yeah, as far as the scientific research goes, there's not a ton in ball python specifically, but there's a lot of research just in general with genetically altering those melanocytes, because all sorts of animals have different morphs, right? You have horses of different colors and rats and whatever. So there's kind of a good amount of information on that side. It's just not directly reptile related.
That's not an issue we really have had in the invert hobby, at least with tarantulas, because there's this misconception that all these different colors, and patterns of tarantulas are different breeds. People think of them like ball pythons, like, oh, there's all these different morphs, and it's like, no, they're not even. Not only are they not the same species, a lot of them aren't even the same genus. Like they won't breed even if you tried. Like they're completely different, branches of the tree there. And there's been controversy with like a big thing in the hobby is keeping everything purebred, not crossbreeding. Like if a tarantula is crossbred with another species, if it's even successful, most people like, all right, nobody, like, you buy it, you keep it, you never breed it, let it die off.
Yeah.
We don't want to muddy the gene pool. And you don't really see it too much because it's difficult. Like I said, they're not the same species. So occasionally you'll see some like Brachypelma species that are very closely related, and people will breed them together. And I don't even know if they're doing it on purpose. Sometimes I think they just assume they're both the same species because they didn't do the research. A lot of hobby breeders are like, well, they look very similar. I want to breed my flame knee, like my Brachypelma homori with my Brachypelma auratum, and it actually produced a viable sack of this like hobby form kind of bastardized tarantula that, and it's not a natural occurring species, and it's very controversial. People get really upset about it, and I understand why. Like it can get really confusing. Like the Tillicodal albopilosum, it's like the curly hair tarantula, has multiple forms right now, mainly because it had been crossbred with a very closely related species. So there's like the hobby form and the Honduras form and the Nicaraguan form, and it's very confusing. And but I couldn't imagine, if it was something like the reptile hobby where you could breed them to kind of bring out different aspects and colors and patterns and stuff like that.
Yeah, like not only do we get the species hybridization, which some people are totally fine with, and some people, like myself, I'd prefer that not to be the case, because like it's even in reptiles, it can be kind of confusing as well. Like it's not as obvious as you might think when you crossbreed two species. Sometimes people don't realize, but the morphs add a whole other dynamic to it that really play into that hedonic treadmill, like I was saying. Like it's even another level of that. Like now you're looking at snakes that have different colors, and now they have different values associated with that. And you get into that breeder mindset where if I produce this fancy morph, it's going to give me a bunch of money. But the inherent value of these animals doesn't change. It's just sort of this, you're hoping that the next person will buy it at the level that you're hoping it's worth in another way. They always value these morphs at a certain price, but as soon as it gets overproduced, the value of that morph hits the bottom, and it can be very confusing to some breeders. Seemingly, they're just like, I bought this snake for $5,000, but now the offsprings are only selling for $1,000, and that will continuously happen. So there's always a strive for finding this new morph and finding another, layering morphs and layering genetics, and at some point we have to wonder how much damage we're doing. Like it would be really interesting to see even lifespans for some of these animals that have like 3 or 4 different genetic mutations that give them a different color. Are they living 10 years shorter? Are they living 15 years shorter? What is the consequence? And in a lot of ways, I think there's no consequence. A lot of times I think we can get away with those things. Like you see these types of things in the wild all the time, like a panther, for example. There's your hypermelanistic cat. It seemingly doesn't have much internal damage that's happened, I don't think, and these animals live wild. So there are certain mutations that don't have a huge impact, but something like spider we know does, and as well as a bunch of other ones. I'm not super familiar with ball python morphs, but there's a few that carry those. There's something that has happened inside the snake to not allow it to function as it should. And I personally think if we are trying to be stewards of a good hobby, we should say, hey, let's question this. Let's really understand what changes we're making before we just flood the market with snakes that have neurological disorders.
Yeah, that's very cool. One of the interesting things in the tarantula hobby, especially in the past few years, research has really kind of ramped up, and you got a lot of scientists now doing like DNA kind of research on tarantulas that really they had never really bothered to do in the past, and they're discovering that, especially with some New World species that we assumed were one species are actually like 2 or 3 different species, and like that's kind of opened up our eyes. Like, well, that's why this species was so difficult to breed in the hobbies, because they weren't the same. They look exactly the same, but on like on that molecular kind of DNA level, they're not the same, and that's why they're we're struggling to breed them. And I'm trying to think. It was the Grammostola pulchra, which is the Brazilian black tarantula, is in Brazil, and on the other side of there's like a river that separates that in Paraguay, I believe. I think it was Paraguay. There's another tarantula that looks just like it, but it's the Kuargi or whatever, however it's been described now, and they visually they look they look identical. So it's not until it molts and you get that molt under a microscope or you do DNA testing that you realize this isn't the same species, and that's why we've been struggling so much to breed it. But then there's other species that are obviously very different, but for whatever reason, people are able to crossbreed them and get these hybrids in the hobby. And it's just something I always found kind of interesting or fascinating. Just in contrast between the reptile and the tarantula hobby is that there seems to be this desire to hybrid or genetically kind of manipulate species of snakes. And then the more you do that, the more rare they are, the more valuable they are. And it's like almost the exact opposite in the hobby. If you've got a hybrid tarantula, nobody wants it. Like you have a hard time giving it away. Everybody wants, purebred, just like from nature.
Yeah, and I wish that the reptile hobby would drift towards that. And I think if tarantulas had morphs, God forbid, it would probably drift the same way, I'm sure, because, people are trying to make different colors. So I do hope that one day we start to realize that the morphs and the hybrids have less value than we think. I get that they're cool and it's interesting, but even within the tarantula hobby, that's why Latin names are so important, right? You guys have a very firm grasp on Latin names because there's so many species that look so similar. But here in the reptile world, it's like we don't really use Latin names, which I'm not opposed to, but we don't often do that. But it sort of caters to that, mixing things up just because they happen to be two pythons. It doesn't mean we should, crossbreed them. And it just sort of just happens in the reptile hobby. I think by virtue of people just wanting, like you're saying, wanting that new rarer thing, without thinking about the deeper implications of what exactly they're doing there and why. Like, are you just doing that because it's something that you're excited to do at this moment, or is there some other reason? And most of the time, there's really no good reason to be doing, a species hybridization other than just testing it to see if it would work.
It's an interesting point you bring up. Like I didn't realize it until just this moment. Kind of a little shame on me. It's like I could tell you the scientific name of every scorpion, tarantula, and invert in my collection. But when it comes to my reptiles, I would have to Google it. I think anytime I've made an Instagram post and included the scientific name, I had to look it up and post it because I don't know the scientific name of any of my reptiles. So yeah,
it's weird, hey? Like, and even me, like I know the scientific names of the reptiles I keep, but I don't use them. So it's not like it doesn't roll off my tongue like you guys do in your hobby. And there are some reptile keepers that only use Latin names, but nobody knows what they're talking about.
That's a good point. I'm notorious for mispronouncing names. It's to the point that it's almost a meme. I'm just waiting for somebody. Every video I put out, I'm like, I've mispronounced this dead language. That person's going to leave some kind of comment.
Yeah.
And my Latin teacher, like I took Latin in high school because I don't know why. I figured it would be easier than taking Spanish. Regret that decision. Like I really wish I would have taken Spanish. It would have been much more useful. But I took 4 years of Latin as my high school, and I think I did it 1 year in college. And I don't know if it's just because I took Latin in West Virginia, they just spoke it with terrible West Virginia Appalachian accents. How I read it and I hear it and I pronounce it, people are like, no, that's way wrong. And I'm like, all right.
It's hard. Like that's one of the reasons I don't use Latin names because I'm not going to reptile meetings and interacting with people who are using these so you can hear them. So if you're just trying to read them, it's like good luck. Like you're gonna mess it up for sure.
Yeah. There's one tarantula, the Philippine tangerine is its common name. Its scientific name is I'm gonna mess it up now. Orphanoculus philippinus. And I always feel really weird saying that. I'm like, I'm going to get demonetized because I said Filipinas.
Exactly.
But yeah. So we can, how often do you upload your podcasts?
I'm going one a week right now.
One a week?
Yeah. So usually every Sunday there's a new episode out.
And do you have a Patreon or any way people can support what you're doing?
No Patreon. The best way to support is just come give me a sub on YouTube and listen to the content and then share it with your friends and your other exotic people in your life.
Right on. So you've got podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, like anywhere there's podcasts. You're kind of distributed everywhere. You've got your YouTube channel. You're on Instagram. I've seen, I believe it was you. You posted some like little screenshots of or clips of your podcast before, right?
Yeah. So I'm on Instagram as well. That's just animals at home CA. Animals at home was taken. So if you just type in animal, I'm sure if you type in animals at home, it will come up, but the handle is animals at home CA, and you'll find me there. And I'm pretty bad with my Instagram. I do post pictures once in a while, but mostly I just, when I upload a new video or a podcast, I'll share a little clip in the story and encourage people to go check it out.
I'm trying to remember how I first came across you. I don't remember if it was YouTube or Instagram, but
probably YouTube. I bet. Actually, I don't know, because my Instagram's not super popular, so I would imagine it was probably YouTube.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it was actually the podcast you did with Tom Moran.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Came up in my feed, and I was like, oh, what is this? And that was like right when I was starting this podcast. And so I started watching yours, essentially just seeing how you were doing it, because I was like, hey, this is very similar to the type of podcast I was wanting to do.
And honestly, that episode was really popular. Like, there's a lot of tarantula people out there that just really love that episode. And we know there's a huge overlap in the hobby anyway, or both hobbies anyway. And yeah, it was a really cool episode for sure.
Yeah, it was. Tom has his own podcast, and I think Tarantula Cat and Bird Spider CH started a podcast where, I mean, she's more on like the hobbyist side, he's more on the field research side. So it's kind of a cool thing they've got going there. And I wanted to start. Essentially, I felt like there was a just kind of a hole, like, in as far as, you know, what people could listen to that are interested in inverts, because it's they're fake. Those two podcasts are focused primarily on tarantulas or other arachnids, and I was like, there's a lot. I keep more than just tarantulas. I also have some reptiles, and I know there's a lot of people that have both, and it's I thought it would be cool to kind of have a common ground where we could talk mainly about tarantulas and arachnids, and but scorpions are something that a lot of people keep, but there's just not a whole lot of content out there for. So I really wanted to bring scorpions and mantis and isopods in it, and snakes and geckos. So, I mean, I appreciate someone like you being willing to come on and talk to me and, tell us some stuff about reptiles that, because I don't know. It's good to have somebody that knows a lot more about that coming on and talking, because I know there's a lot of people out there that, are keeping tarantulas, but also have some reptiles that would really benefit from checking out your podcast and kind of diving down that hole.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate coming on, and I think the podcast space is still, like I said, it's an infant, so more people jumping on that type of media I think is great. We can have a little bit of, a suite of different episodes that hit different niches, I think would be awesome. So I really appreciate spending the 2 hours with you today. This was fantastic.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. How long are your podcasts normally?
They will range from usually between 1 and 2 hours.
Okay.
I think probably average hits around 90 minutes.
Yeah, I try to do 90 minutes to 2 hours. I had one or two that were like almost 4 hours, and I was like, nobody's going to listen to this, but those people did. It's amazing.
Oh yeah, because it's so easy to listen to. You just put it on your phone, and then you jump in your car. It starts playing. It might take you a week to get through it, but it's still people will still listen to it. And like I said, people are still learning about podcasts. Sometimes people will comment like, "Why are your videos so long?" It's like, don't sit on YouTube and watch the whole podcast. Like, go to your phone, download it, and go for a run. Like, it's kind of strange.
Yeah. Anytime I'm like feeding and watering and just maintaining enclosures, if I'm not playing music, I got a podcast going on in the background. So it's when I listen to Tom Moran and when I listen to your show and a few others, it's a good way to kind of like be involved in the hobby, like doing the chores, I guess.
Totally.
Of the hobby, while also learning and kind of getting your mind opened up to new things. So thank you so much for doing what you do and having that podcast. And, I'm going to leave a link to your website and your YouTube channel for anybody watching this like on YouTube. But if you're just listening to the podcast, definitely check it out. It's animalsathome.ca.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right, buddy. Hopefully, maybe in the future you can come back on and talk some more, because I'm sure there's a lot more that we could be discussing.
Well, and we'll get you on my show as well at some point in the next month or two.
Yeah, that would be exciting. I'd like to do that.
Cool.
All right, man. Well, thanks again for coming on. And to everybody listening, upload every Thursday. There will be a new podcast. You can find it on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anywhere you listen to your podcast. And thank you all for listening. I will see you next Thursday. Bye.